Please check the course calendar for current text references for this lesson. This is the first of a three-part lesson. The 1920s were really a tale of three eras. The first era, lasting roughly from 1919 to 1922, was a period of restlessness and discontent. The second era, lasting roughly from 1922 to 1929, was characterized by extreme prosperity, intense racism and nativism, and a desire to promote American culture at the expense of more traditional European ideals. And the last era, which really can only be looked at as 1 year, 1929, represented how the false prosperity of the 20s represented a false sense of security and a false infallible belief in the American economic system. So we'll look at all three eras by beginning with era number one first. America at the end of World War I was a nation disillusioned and weary from involvement in world affairs. World War I, after all, had represented a dichotomy, horses and airplanes in the same war. And in post-wartime America, there was rampant xenophobia. The word xenophobic means an unfounded fear of foreign ideas and foreign people. Also, Americans wanted to promote the idea or the concept of Americanism and went about persecuting those that represented a threat to these ideals. People such as political radicals, anarchists, socialists, pacifists, those people who had been opposed to World War I and America's involvement in it, and of course communists rather. This created an atmosphere that was intensely and hyper-patriotic, and all of these sentiments would lead to the Great Red Scare of 1919. The Great Red Scare of 1919 was a period marked by an irrational fear of communism and communists in America. It led to witch hunts of suspected communists in the government, industry, and in private American life. Now, there are various factors that led to the Red Scare, or why people felt threatened by communism. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin overthrew the Tsarist Russian government that America had developed an alliance with during World War I. Americans then would come to equate communism with anarchy and support for an overthrow of the American way of life. A continuous stream of Eastern European and Russian Jewish immigrants prompted many Americans to question their loyalty to America. Then there was also economic instability. This was also a contributing factor. The rapid demobilization of the armed forces, combined with massive layoffs as America's factories ratcheted down their production to pre-war levels, resulted in economic unease that Americans wanted to look to scapegoat as a way of explaining what was happening to them because of forces beyond their control or ability to understand. High unemployment and shaky economic conditions exacerbated Americans' angst with the labor movement. Now, it should be pointed out that whenever there is a period of high economic uncertainty, Americans will resort to scapegoating to explain the source or the cause of the problems. If you look at the year 1920, there were 70,000 communists in America, out of a total population of around 106 million. These 70,000 communists were blamed for America's economic problems. Some Americans resorted to using communists as a scapegoat for America's dismal economic conditions. However, it's doubtful that that's really an accurate or fair assessment of what was causing the economic unease in the immediate post-war period of the late 19-teens, early 1920s. In 1918, 9 million Americans were employed by the war industries. Also in that year, there were over 4 million troops or military-related personnel drawing a paycheck from the armed forces. So in 1919, with all of the displacement and factory demobilization that was going on, this would result in the displacement of over 13 million workers. This more than likely created the economic turmoil, more so than 70,000 communists ever could. But politicians do take advantage of shaky economic conditions, and it didn't help that in the summer of 1919, there was a rash of labor violence that many would come to associate with communists. One organization stands out in particular, and that would be the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies as they were called. The Wobblies were long considered a radical socialist labor union and was blamed for labor strike violence that killed several people in a couple of states and a handful of cities. There were violent labor demonstrations in the harbors of New York City, where strikes between boat owners and longshoremen over their rights for better hours and wages led to violent confrontations that resulted in the deaths of several people there. You also had a rash of bombings in the summer of 1919. Politicians and high-profile Americans were targets of such incidences as mail bombings and the like. So this would actually lead to the wholesale arrest and deportation of foreign nationals suspected of committing these radical and violent acts. And it would also lead to the rise and the establishment of self-proclaimed patriotic groups, groups such as the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the National Security League, the American Legion, and the Ku Klux Klan, which had been dormant for many years or had mainly been a Southern phenomena, and as an organization is actually going to enjoy a resurgence on the national stage during the 1920s, something we'll look at a little bit later. Add to all of the social and political unrest of 1919 was the picture of a presidency in a bit of disarray. In the summer of 1919, Woodrow Wilson, in the last full year of his term, suffered a debilitating collapse and ended up dying just 5 short years later, with the United States never having joined the League of Nations. Remember, it was Wilson who gave birth to the idea of an international peacekeeping organization, and it would be his own country that would come to reject its aims. Wilson did win the Nobel Prize in 1919, acclaimed by the selection committee for his visionary leadership in the concept of international peacekeeping. By 1920, America was a country that had increased in ethnoculturally inspired tensions because of a few reasons. First, there was the displacement brought on by World War I that resulted in, among other things, the Great Migration of African Americans northward. Then you had the migration of women into the paid workforce and a continuous immigration from so-called exotic groups. These tensions would define the first part of the 1920s as America struggled to define what it meant to actually be an American. Struggling to define what or who was an American would be one of the several unique themes of the election of 1920. Here's where the country stood demographically during that election year. The census of that year indicated that there were 106 million Americans that lived in the contiguous United States, which represented a 30% increase since the year 1900. The American Empire added another 12 million to that number. The 1920 census was the first census count in American history that showed that more Americans lived in cities than in rural areas. There were more men than women, and of the numbers that were counted in the American census, 14 million were born elsewhere, and another 23 million had parents that were born elsewhere. As far as the election stats go for the election of 1920, one way that we can look at it is to do a comparison between where things stood politically before the election and where things stood afterwards. So when you look at the Senate, Before the election of 1920, which would represent the last congressional year of Wilson's presidency, we find that in the Senate, the Republicans had a two-seat majority. In the House, they had a majority that was obviously bigger because there are more representatives serving in the House of Representatives, but you can see their margin of advantage there, looking at the numbers. After the fall elections, look at what happens to those margins. I mean, there's almost an exponential growth in the margins there. That the country is going to take a decided turn rightward. And not only do we see the Republicans pick up additional seats in both the House and the Senate, the Republicans are also going to take the White House. It is this gentleman, Republican Warren G. Harding, who is going to win the presidential election of 1920 by positioning himself as the antithesis of Woodrow Wilson. He was small town in outlook and was modestly educated, whereas Woodrow Wilson had a PhD in economics. Harding would be the first senator from Ohio to get elected under the 17th Amendment, which was the direct vote senator amendment. Now, interestingly, Warren Harding, even though he was a conservative, was fairly progressive in his views on women's suffrage, a measure or a move that he supported. He was, however, supportive of prohibition, which was the 18th Amendment that gets ratified in the year 1919, that is going to place a prohibition on the sale, manufacture, and distribution of alcoholic beverages. Harding's campaign slogan was going to be "Back to Normalcy," meaning that America should retreat from involvement in international issues and focus on domestic matters. This slogan also somehow seemed to suggest that America's global misadventures during the World War I years were decidedly not normal. Harding had a rather unconventional campaign style. He didn't do campaign stops. He didn't travel the country. Instead, he conducted a front porch campaign where voters would come to visit him at his front porch in Marion, Ohio, and some of his speeches would be broadcast by the radio. His election is also notable because his was the first presidential election in which women were allowed the vote. Now, on a more personal note, Warren G. Harding, the man, married a woman who was 5 years his senior. Her name, or her nickname rather, was the Duchess. Her real name was Florence Mabel King, and she came from a rather wealthy family. King was a divorcee, and by all accounts was rather domineering and henpecked her husband. The fact that Warren G. Harding married King was a little bit of a controversy and a little bit of caused a little bit of a stir in the 1920s. The fact that she had a divorce status, which was somewhat rare in those days. But to get back to a discussion about King, King was the daughter of Marion, Ohio, which was the hometown that Warren G. Harding was from. She was the daughter of the wealthiest man in that community, and he actually threatened to cut her off for her marriage to Harding because of his suspected black heritage. It was widely believed that Harding's paternal grandmother may have been black. 5 times Harding was committed to a sanatorium for, quote, his nerves. And I imagine that in a different media climate, that fact would have caused a little bit of controversy and definitely attracted more attention than it did for the time. Now, by all accounts, Warren G. Harding was considered to be a genuinely nice guy who did smoke and drink, but was stopped from chewing tobacco in public by his wife. I like to give little tidbits about the historical figures that I'm talking about because I think it humanizes them, and I think it's something that some of you are fairly interested in. As for some of the legislative highlights of the Warren G. Harding presidency, we have the Budget Act of 1921, which called upon the federal government to have or operate under a balanced budget. There was also the Shepherd-Towner Act of 1921, and this piece of legislation was fairly remarkable given the conservative nature of not just Congress but the country at the time. The Shepherd-Towner Act of 1921 was actually the first legislative health care act ever enacted by an American Congress. This was a law that gave in which the federal government would give money to state governments to support hospital care for women and children in rural areas. Now, it would actually expire in 1929, and a more conservative Congress and president that would come along after Harding in the late 1920s essentially allowed it to expire. But I just want to point out that this is, again, a fairly remarkable legislative development given the conservative nature of both Harding, the Congress that he swept into Congress along with him in the election of 1920s, especially given all of the recent controversy over the federal health care law of the last year. So it's just kind of remarkable that you had a Republican president and a Republican Congress actually enact the first piece of federal level health care legislation. And also remarkable is what that legislation actually did. Also fairly remarkable is the fact that Warren G. Harding, a Republican, was a stronger proponent of civil rights of any American president prior to the presidency of Harry S. Truman than any president had been, Republican or Democrat, except for maybe, say, Abraham Lincoln. His civil rights record and his civil rights advocacy was certainly far better than that of his predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat. And who, under his watch, actually instituted Jim Crow legislation in the federal government in Washington, D.C., in federal buildings there. So Warren G. Harding is someone that we should take note of for that reason as well. Warren G. Harding would issue a number of pardons to Americans who had been convicted or found guilty of trespassing based on the Sedition Act of 1917. Remember that law where it was illegal to speak out against the American government and its involvement in World War I? Well, Warren G. Harding is going to issue a number of pardons to Americans who got caught transgressing that law, most notably Eugene Debs, who was probably one of the most outspoken critics of American involvement in World War I. He was convicted on federal sedition charges and would later run for president himself as a socialist in 1924. Well, Harding's presidency is going to be short-lived. He's going to die in August 1923, and he dies before revelations of scandals that could have potentially sunk his presidency through maybe impeachment or investigation at the very least, ever became public. Probably the most notable of these scandals was the Teapot Dome scandal. This was the major scandal associated with the Harding administration, and it involved members of Harding's so-called Ohio Gang. The Ohio Gang was a group associated with President Warren Harding who served as informal advisors to the president, some of whom the president actually appointed to cabinet level positions. Chief among those advisors was long-term Harding associate from Ohio, Albert Fall. Albert Fall, who was Harding's friend from Ohio, was appointed Secretary of the Interior. And this is the department that has oversight over federal lands. Using his position, Fall is going to get the United States Navy to transfer stewardship of oil reserves that were set aside for use by the Navy that were located on federal lands in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. He is then going to receive a monetary kickback from the energy companies for arranging this deal. He is paid handsomely, actually, by the energy companies for his role in making these arrangements. Well, he's going to get caught. He's going to be convicted of the crime of malfeasance, which literally means wrongdoing, and he's going to be sentenced to 1 year in prison and made to pay a $100,000 fine. So the Teapot Dome scandal, revelation of it, close Harding associate, and there's evidence to suggest that Harding himself may have known about the scandal at the very least and did nothing to bring fall to heel for his role in this. At any rate, Harding is not going to himself suffer any personal ill effects, aside from maybe having his legacy marred because of the scandal falling under his watch.